Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for the purpose of inquiring to the Majority Leader the schedule for next week.
Without objection, so ordered.
I also ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Now I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Maryland, my friend, the Majority Leader of the House.
I thank my friend, Mr. Scalise, for yielding. I also thank him for not mentioning the LSU-Maryland game one more time.
Only because we're no longer in the mix as well,
I know.
Mr.
We're both lamenting that fact. On Monday, Madam Speaker, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business, with votes postponed until 6:30 p.m. On Tuesday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour debate and 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Wednesday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. On Thursday and Friday, no votes are expected in the House. We will consider several bills under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by close of business tomorrow. Madam Speaker, the House will also consider H.R. 1644, Save the Internet Act of 2019. This bill will reverse the administration's repeal of critical net neutrality protections, which will empower the FCC to prohibit unjust, unreasonable, and discriminatory practices, and ensures consumers can make informed decisions when shopping for Internet plans. This bill also enacts the authorities to support expanding broadband to rural communities and struggling Americans. In addition, Madam Speaker, it is possible the House will take action to set the budget levels for discretionary spending for the next 2 fiscal years. And I yield back to my friend, the Republican whip.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I look forward to a robust debate on the unaptly titled bill, Save the Internet. I think a lot of people shiver at the thought of the federal government saving us from the Internet, and the Title II regulation that would be imposed would allow the Internet to be regulated like a utility. This is not the phone company of the 1970s. This is probably one of the greatest innovations that America has produced for the world, allowing us to be a world leader, dominant leader in a growing technology field, primarily because the government hasn't figured out how to regulate it. It's been able to grow so robustly. I would hope that we have that full debate and people are very aware of the negative connotations and ultimately the damaging effects of a federal regulation of the Internet that could slow down that dramatic innovation that we've seen with the federal government not regulating it. Be a robust debate. Hopefully we debate a number of other issues. I know we had a robust debate on the floor just a little while ago on the BDS movement. This is a growing concern for all of us who feel passionately about Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. I know the Majority Leader's been a leader in this Congress and a leader throughout this country in an incredibly bipartisan way, standing up for that unique relationship. But we've seen threats from other countries. You've seen heavy debate in Europe. You've seen debate in areas in Palestinian circles who want to undermine Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state by trying to boycott products made in Israel, to crush Israel's economy. And that's why it's so important that we stand up against this BDS movement. And while we weren't successful in the motion to recommit, there is legislation that's incredibly bipartisan. S1, a bill that's come over from the Senate, unfortunately hasn't been referred to committee, but also H.R. 336, similar legislation that would allow us to help support our friends around the world who want to stand up against the BDS movement, stand with our good friend Israel. And I'd like to ask the gentleman, is there any plan to allow either or both of those bills to come to the floor so we can send a strong message to our friends around the world and to enemies of Israel as well, that we're not going to support this BDS movement? And I yield.
As the gentleman knows, we share views, as he's expressed, and we are awaiting the committee action, and when the committee acts, we will make a determination of how to go forward.
And if I could further inquire, S1 has not been referred to committee. Is there a plan to refer the bill to committee and ultimately to allow it to move through the process, as it's been incredibly bipartisan, but also incredibly timely that we as the United States Congress stand with our friend Israel and stand against what is a growing movement that should be of concern to all of us. I yield.
As I said, I agree with the gentleman's objective and position with respect to BDS. The committee has legislation before it and is considering it, as you know, Mr. Schneider and Mr. Nadler, I think, are the co-sponsors of that legislation. I expect the committee to consider it, and then at that point in time, we'll make a decision how to move forward.
Those pieces of legislation are just resolutions, not actual policy. And ultimately, if we're going to make the stand, it has to be legislation with teeth, with actual authorizing language, and with the ability for us to give true support to our friends, not just words, but actions as well. So hopefully we can move both. And I would just continue to urge, and the gentleman from Maryland's support for Israel is unquestioned and has been admired by people on both sides. I would just urge that we as a House move those bills, one or both of the actual substantive bills, to the floor as quickly as possible, so that, as they've already moved through the Senate, S1 had 77 votes in support, so strongly bipartisan, coming out of the Senate. Still no referral in the House. Hopefully we can get that expedited. And with that, on the idea of legislating by resolution, I know that's been a growing trend in this Congress of this majority to move, instead of substantive bills, to deal with things like lowering health care costs or helping create more jobs. There have been a lot of bills that are just press releases, resolutions that don't actually change law or help shape policy or work in a bipartisan way to get bills to the president's desk that can address the growing issues that our country faces. Are we going to see a continued trend in this majority of just resolutions, or are we going to finally get to bipartisan policy on some of these big issues? And I yield.
Well, of course, as the gentleman well knows, we've, Madam Speaker, passed many substantive pieces of legislation that we've sent to the Senate. H.R. 1, a very broad reaching reform bill, trying to assure voting rights and access for everybody, trying to assure fair redistricting throughout the country, trying to make sure that dark money does not control our elections, and making sure that we're operating both in the executive and the legislative agency with ethical conduct. They have all, that passed overwhelmingly, passed unanimously on our side. I forget exactly how many.
Opposed unanimous on our side, if I could point out.
Today's vote, obviously, we had two very substantive pieces of legislation, one of which is going now to the president, and the other of which, the Violence Against Women Act, had a significant bipartisan vote, as the gentleman knows, passed the House. We've done the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which had been pending for some period of time, in making that a permanent piece of legislation. We've made sure that women, 1963, we passed the Equal Pay Act. John Kennedy signed it. Unfortunately, we are still struggling to make sure that that promise is realized and that women are in fact paid based upon what they do, not based upon what their gender is. So I would say to my friend, we've passed a lot of legislation. We have pending, and we're doing a lot of hearings. We're dealing with infrastructure. We're dealing with drug prices. We made it a big issue in the campaign. We're moving ahead to make sure that the Affordable Care Act works in a way that it was designed to work. So that I would say to my friend that we have pursued both on the floor and in committee the substantive legislation that we've talked to the American people about. I also feel very strongly that we want to avoid what happened to us at the end of the last Congress when you were in the majority. We shut down the government, and I'm going to be working hard, hopefully on both sides of the aisle. I don't think anybody wants to see that as an objective, so I'm hopeful that we can work together. I'm working with your chairman of your ranking member on the Appropriations Committee, Kay Granger, with whom I've served for some period of time, and Ms. Lowy, to make sure that we get the appropriation bills done in a timely fashion and send them to the Senate. I'm hopeful that that will occur. and I'm hopeful that we will fund the government in a rational way and not shut down government, which was so irrational and so harmful to our country and so costly to our taxpayers. So those are some of the things that we have done, are doing, and will do. And hopefully we can, to some degree, work in as bipartisan a fashion as possible. In particular, the President has said he wants to bring the costs of prescription drugs down. We share that view. I'm hopeful that we can work together. The President said he wants a substantial infrastructure piece of legislation. We share that view. We hope we can work together on that. So we have been pursuing on a weekly basis, and this was, from our perspective, a pretty good week. I know we disagree on the net neutrality bill, but we do agree it is a major piece of legislation, and I expect to pass that next week as well. And I yield back to my friend.
Thank the gentleman. And it was heavily debated in committee, in the Energy and Commerce Committee, as it should be, and I'm sure it'll be heavily debated on the floor. A number of these other issues that the gentleman mentioned, we litigated those on the floor, the ones that went over to the Senate, some with only Democrat votes, where, H.R. 1, for example, where the Senate Majority Leader made it very clear that bill will not get any time on the Senate calendar, and there are a lot of others that we would like to see real movement on. I know it was concern of a lot of people that there were 3 different committees in the House this week that spent the bulk of their time going after the President personally again. We've got the Mueller report coming. The summary has already been laid out, and it made it clear there was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction of justice. We'll see the report, and what we talked about was that the report be filed in compliance with law. And law makes it very clear that things like classified information aren't released. That's the law. And I think we agreed that that's how it should be, that you don't release classified information. You release the pertinent details, and I look forward to seeing that, and we will see that. But then it seemed like a continued assault in 3 different committees, continuing to focus on harassing the President personally as opposed to focusing on some of those policies. But one of the policies that should be coming out of the House, where there is a real deadline, is a budget. April 15th is the deadline. I know over and over again, members of the Democrat leadership, including the Speaker herself, said, quote, "Show me your budget, show me your values." There is no budget. And we've been concerned that the agenda doesn't follow. The priorities in the budget are really what you lay out. Those are your values. Those are your priorities. And if the gentleman, while they're moving a bill that lays out caps, it's not bipartisan, but ultimately when we get a caps agreement, the gentleman knows it's going to have to be a bipartisan agreement. Last night, the Budget Committee produced only a partisan one-corner deal, barely a one-corner deal. Typically, they have what are called 4-corner deals, where the House, Senate, Republicans, and Democrats come together and say, we're going to agree on what those spending levels need to be so that we can then write our appropriations bills, set the priorities of the country, and avoid a government shutdown. That didn't happen in the Budget Committee. It was a very partisan bill that was moved out, but more importantly, it was not a budget. And I would hope that with the little bit of time that's remaining to meet that legal deadline, that the majority would try to actually produce a budget and follow through on those over and over again quotes, "Show me your budget, show me your values." And I yield.
I thank the gentleman for his comment. Of course, there was no budget last year until very, very late in the year. What was done was what we will certainly make sure we do very early on, is to try to establish the numbers, which, of course, a caps deal would do. And our objective will be to show our values in the appropriation bills as they come to the floor, hopefully in a timely fashion. And our main objective will be not to shut down the government, but to do our work on time. And I'm confident that working together, we can reach that objective. I yield back.
Hopefully we can get a bipartisan agreement on what those levels need to be to properly fund our defense, to properly do the other things government should do in as limited a way as possibly can be carried out, and then ultimately to be able to get the bills that follow it passed in time well before the September 30th deadline. One of the areas that there is very productive movement on is the new trade deal between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, USMCA. I know there are bipartisan working groups. The White House has been in negotiations with the majority, the Speaker and your team. Can the leader give any insight into where the conversations are going in the House to get a timetable for when we can start having a plan for when that, because you look at Canada, their House of Commons, I apologize, Canada's House of Commons, it has their own deadline of when they rise, and obviously we want to be aware of our other partners that are included in this negotiation. Is there talk of a timeline yet, and if the leader could share where those conversations are going, and I yield.
As the gentleman may know, the Speaker invited Mr. Lighthizer to address members of the Democratic caucus on where we stood. As you know, that agreement has not been submitted. The Speaker said the other day that in order to consider that in a positive way, the Mexicans, which the President has been somewhat critical of through the years, to take certain actions which make sure that our workers and their workers are treated fairly, so we're competing on an even keel. But we certainly are in discussions. There are a number of items that of concern, as has historically been of concern, regarding the environment, regarding workers' rights, regarding the availability of drugs for prescription drugs for people, as well as enforcement, dispute resolution. So those are being discussed. The conversations are ongoing, and I believe that the administration will make a determination when they believe it is timely to submit that document to us. As you know, once they do so, there is a time frame in which the House and Senate must act, the committees must act within essentially a 3-month period of time. So we are in discussions. We're waiting on the administration's judgment as to when to submit, and I'm sure they're discussing with us as to when we think that's timely as well. But there's still substantive matters that are being discussed. I would presume some of those are on your side as well. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman, and I'm encouraged by the conversations that both I've been in as well as the conversations that I'm aware are going on your side as well, because this is a bipartisan win for the country. This is a bill that this agreement would help ensure that as we all support free trade, we also want more fair trade, and this agreement in many different categories and many different industries would help create more American jobs and help American workers get treated even more fairly by our neighbors in the North and South. Finally, if I may inquire to the gentleman, we've talked a number of times about the Born Alive Act, the bill that we've made multiple unanimous consent requests to bring up, the discharge petition moving through the process. There are other means to bring it up even quicker, and one would be if the gentleman would schedule the bill for the floor. And I would just inquire, is there any plan to schedule the Born Alive Act on the floor through a direct means versus some of these other tools that are being considered? And I yield.
I'll thank the gentleman for his question. As the gentleman knows, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, the House voted on this bill during the last 2 Congresses. The most recent time it was brought to the floor, the gentleman and his party were in control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency. That bill was not brought up in the Senate. So the gentleman mentioned earlier H.R. 1, and that Mr. McConnell had said that wouldn't be brought up. In fact, when it was passed this House, it went to the Senate, and it was not brought up by Senator McConnell. So there are no plans at this point in time for us to bring this up.
Well, I appreciate
the
candor. We will continue to pursue other tools that we have available, and as the growing momentum around the country builds, as people saw what happened in New York with a law ushered in that allows babies to be murdered after they're born alive. The Virginia governor gruesomely describing what he hoped to be a similar law in his state, but other states are taking those same kind of actions, and so there is a growing bipartisan interest that feels very strongly that we need a federal law to protect babies who are born alive outside the womb. So we'll continue to pursue all of those tools that are available, and look forward to the work the week ahead, next week, as we finish our work prior to the Easter recess. And unless the gentleman has anything else,
I have nothing further to say. Thank you.
then thank the gentleman from Maryland. And Madam Speaker, I yield back.